Hello and welcome to episode 2 of my Photoshop tutorials for Second Life editors. In this one we're going to be talking about some basic shading. When I say basic, most likely the more common ways of shading and probably a few tips and tricks for it. In this video I'm also going to be doing a lot of keyboard shortcuts, so again you'll see my annotations down here in the corner of when I push keys. I'm also going to be using heavy use of the Gaussian blur, and this is going to be located under filter, under filter, blur, and Gaussian blur. Now, I really don't like to constantly go up here to find this thing. I like to use a keyboard shortcut. And how you can set a keyboard shortcut for these things, you can go to Edit, to Keyboard Shortcuts, and then you have all your different shortcuts in here. Now, I prefer to leave the Photoshop defaults and make a new shortcut list. That's just personal preference. So in case something gets messed up, you can always undo it without having to go through each of your shortcuts and undo it through the options here. So in this case, I'm going to be setting a shortcut for blur, Gaussian blur. And then over here, you type in your keyboard combination that you want to use. So like, let's say if I wanted to do Control-Alt-G. Well, sorry. It's going to pop up a warning in this case saying it's already being, this keyboard shortcut is already in use. And it's actually being used to create or release clipping masks, and I actually don't want to use that because I actually use clipping masks a lot. So what about Control-Shift-G? In this case, G for Gaussian. And again, this one's already in use. And in this case, it's being used by ungroup layers. Well, I don't really ungroup layers too much, so not a big deal. So I'm going to accept, and then I'm just going to leave ungroup layers without a keyboard shortcut. So now, if I paint a little bit here in the middle, I'm going to do Control-Shift-G, it'll bring up my Gaussian blur a lot quicker than having to go through that menu. Okay, so we're going to be talking about shading here. And the first thing I want to talk about is just some really basic light theory. Now, on the screen here, I have two different circles. Now, if you're just looking at these, they just look like circles, but we're actually going to make them look like spheres. We're actually going to give them a three-dimensional shape. And that's kind of the point of doing shading, is to make things look more three-dimensional, to actually give it some depth. Now, the left one, I'm just going to leave as an example of where we started, and I'm going to work on the right one here. So I'm going to create a new layer, and then I'm going to clip this. And remember, in my previous video I talked about where if you have a clipping layer, it'll clip to only the visible pixels it is clipped to. And over here you can see that this icon, this downward arrow, is showing that it is clipped. So if I paint out here, nothing happens. If I paint through here, you'll see it'll only paint on the visible areas. So now if we had a light coming on straight from where we're viewing this in a sphere, we could, or even from the top left over here, we know that like for a sphere, if it's shiny, there's going to be some light up there. So I'm just painting in white here just to illustrate. And as it rounds the edge, it would have a light over here. And this is just basic light theory. I'm not going to talk about too much about light theory in this video, but mostly just, kind of touching on some of these things. So let's go ahead and blur this, and let's blur this to a pretty good amount and make it nice and smooth. And already it looks a lot more three-dimensional. We've only added one thing. So I'm going to go ahead and add another layer here, and I'm going to clip it, except this time I'm going to use the clipping shortcut, which is Control-Alt-G, or Control-Option-G for those on Mac. And now I'm going to paint with some black. And I'm going to paint what they call a contact shadow. And that's where two things are really close. In this case, the ground, or the surface this is on, but also the dark side of the sphere, what's away from the light source. And of course it doesn't look pretty, but that's why we blur. I'm going to go a little more on the blurring here on this one. A little crazy. I'm also going to create a new layer underneath it. And I'm going to create a black area here just for a shadow. This is basic shadowing, basic shading. And again, I'm going to blur it. I'm not going to go so strong on it this time. But now you can see that this really is starting to look like a sphere. And I mean, there's a lot more details we could put in it, but that's only using 3 layers. We got a highlight we added, a shadow light and a contact light, and we have an under light where it's actually physically starting to meet this invisible plane of existence we have. So, okay, so let's unclick that. This is what we're going to be using today to show some shading examples. Now, this is a good friend Kat. She let me take her picture with the permission, of course, to show it and how to do some of these techniques. And we're going to be using this for a few tutorials here as we go along. So, when you're working about doing shading, you always got to think about where is the light coming from. So, you just grab a nice bright yellow here and illustrate. So, I've decided in this picture that I want the light to be coming from the right side, and you know what, I even want this to be maybe a little more above, coming down. That way we can have some nice shadows, you know, coming off. Something that I do when I take a picture is I always kind of envision what my end result is going to want to be like. And sometimes I'll even take my brush here and I'll say, okay, well, there's a few things I'm going to need to fix. Like, I'm going to need to fix the shape or whatever, or I'm going to need to fix some broken prims. And I've already done a little bit on this thing, but nowhere near as much because I do want to show how to do those things in a later video. But if we're just talking about shadows, let's do one of the more common ones here. Under the face, or under the chin. And you notice how I'm doing it this way over here and not over here. And that's because we have our light source, so the light's going this way. And then we just start looking at the other things. Well, there's going to be a shadow coming off of the hair right here. Not a huge one. And then, of course, there'll be a whole bunch of other shadows that we could. There's lots of awesome detail in this outfit. There's also going to be a shadow coming off around here from the hair, and the same idea right about here. Mind you, I'm not going up this far because the light becomes linear at that point, and that's something I'll talk about in advanced shading and more about compositing too also later. But other things, you know, are very obvious. We're going to have shadows over here, shadows, and then we also want to be thinking about highlights. So I'm going to grab another color here. We're going to talk about highlights. So on anybody's skin, if they have any kind of sheen to their skin, they're going to have highlights on their skin, because this is where this Omni light source is coming from. There'd be some of the hair on the side here, maybe even off this jewelry, this side of the face, some more on the cheekbone right there. Collarbone area would probably enhance, you know, and you're kind of looking to add those two contrasts together, the shadows and the highlights. If you just have one, it looks good, but if you have both to show the full range of how round or the shaping of something, the better it's going to look. So let's do, I could do all of this in this video because it would just take way too long. But let's just do something basic. Like we'll do this chin shadow here. So there's a lot of different ways I can do this. Now this is on its own layer. It's been cut out already, and I'll show people how to do a cutout in another video. And I'm just going to use a clipping layer onto this, and I'm going to kind of draw out basically where I want my shadow here. So the light's coming down this way. We're going to want some shadow to come off probably right about there. Now you notice this is not very not very clean looking, and there's a reason for that. Now this is where you want to start thinking about how you want to do shadows and what kind of shadows you want to do. Now if I just have this right here and I lower the opacity, and as you can see we're on a normal layer, it'll give us a shadow effect, and especially if we bring it down, and it's not bad. Now a lot of people do like to use soft light, and soft light does work. However, let me bring up the opacity here. You can see it's actually changing the color tone a lot, and so this might not be necessarily the best method for this particular image. Different skin tones and different tonalities in general will require different kinds of shadows. So you can always just start going through your stuff here and taking a peek. Ooh, overlay, man. Look at how burned that is. So I might actually just do multiply, which is black in this case, and I'm just going to lower the opacity here. And I'm going to take note of a couple things here. Let's say 30%, and that's going to be the number I'm going to use for most of my hard shadows, which is what we're calling this. Now when you're doing shading and you're doing light sources, you got to think about something in terms of the relationship of the distance. If you have a really bright light, no matter how far away it is, so like the sun for example, you're going to have really hard shadows. Now if it's like an artificial light, like a studio light or a light source that's close by, it'll also give you a hard light. But if it's diffused, if it's a soft light, it'll have a soft shadow. So, oops. If we go to Gaussian blur this, let's press back down, go down. You can bring this up until it starts to blur, and you get a nice, effect for your blur. In this case, 9 looks pretty good, and I can just flip this back and forth to see. Now, that looks pretty good for now. However, if you look, we see we got some shadow going on to the chin here. We don't want that. So I'm just going to use a quick mask here, and I'm going to paint in black on that mask. Because remember, black turns pixels invisible on layer masks. And I'm just going to brush through here really quickly. Nothing super accurate, and you can see now I'm getting kind of a white line right there. So I can come back through here, zoom in with white, and I could just paint that back to where I want that to be, in this case right up against the chin. All the way over to there. And I see that I actually got some shadow coming off of here, so I'm just going to paint that with black to make it invisible. So you can see already we've already added one layer of shadow. So if I just quickly go through here, and I can do the exact same thing. So clipping mask, multiply. I'm going to bring this down to 30% just because I know I'm going to want 30% for most of my shadows here, because most of them are going to be the same shadow. And I could just start doing some really quick painting here, just to kind of get my base shadows going. Some of the shadows we talked about, I kind of outlined here. Oh, we got, we also got some shadow back in the hair. And I mean, you can go really crazy on how 3D you want this to make it look. There'd be a shadow over here, and a shadow over here, but this would actually be offsetted. So what I mean by that is, in the breast area here, there's actually more 3D work going here. This isn't just a flat piece of a flat skin area. This actually has breast, and then there's a gap right here. So, and the gap is going to have a bigger shadow versus how close it is to the cloth up here. And then same idea, you can either decide to make this really far away from the body or really close. And this for me would be really close. Because this would be, I would think this would be really close. Now, it does look like it's coming off from the side, and that's something we'll talk about, how to correct some of those things with liquefying and smudging and clone stamping in another video here. But again, you notice how I'm always doing this direction because I want the shadows to all be matching. If you don't do that, it's going to look like you kind of hodgepodged the shadows. You want them all kind of going in the same direction. And there's not going to be too much shadow showing from over here compared to over here, because the light is coming from that direction. Again, this is all basic shading stuff. So let's zoom out here to get a more full view of what we've done, just some basic shading. And of course, go ahead and Gaussian blur this to where I want this to be. And I always start at the bottom and kind of work my way up and just see how it looks. Because if we just start at the high, we're going to have to bring this down. I mean, different ways you can go about doing it. So this doesn't look too bad. I don't mind this so much. So we can just flip this on and off, and with both of them you can see what's going on here. And of course, if you go over, you can always mask. Now now when I was painting up here, the reason I overpainted and masked, and I'll show you why we do that. So let's take this nose for example. Now, if I go and I want to 30%, I want to brush in here a nose shadow on the side, right? You notice how I'm painting over? Well, let's say you don't do that. Let's say you just paint on the edge. Okay? And you don't, let's just extend that up. Just for, oops, my tablet here messed up a little bit. And you don't have to have a tablet, but I do highly recommend it to anybody who really wants to do a lot of this. And you can get them pretty cheap. You can get them for under $100. You don't have to get Wacom, and that's something I could talk about or discuss in a later video if someone's interested. So I've painted right on the edge here, and now I'm going to blur. I'm going to show you what happens here. So as you go and blur, it goes over the line. But if you look really careful, there's a white line forming right here. And that's because when you blur, it blurs outward. So I'm going to delete all this. I'm going to do it again. But this time I'm going to make my shadow. But now over here on the edge of the nose, I'm going to overpaint on purpose. So when I blur it, I can mask it and I'll have a nice clean edge. So let's go ahead and blur that. Same power. And it's going over, but we're now getting that halo. That's what they call those white lines, unintended white lines and stuff. And we can just go through here and we could do a quick mask. And now you have a very prominent edge of a shadow. It's going to look a little more natural. Now this obviously doesn't look really good because I'm just trying to do this quickly, but you can see what's going on here. So that's kind of the real basics of doing shadow work, is be soft or be hard depending on your light source. Make sure you're consistent with where the light is coming from. Now the opposite of that is just doing highlights, and it's almost the exact same thing. So in this case I'm going to use screen because that's the opposite of multiply. And in this case, I'm going to paint with white. Remember how I said we were going to add like a sheen on the shoulder here, because she has some awesome skin. We're going to add some highlight right there. On this edge of the nose, maybe up in here, just kind of do this really quick and dirty. Maybe a little bit on the hair, on this, just this side, because we're going to talk about hair specifically and in great detail, maybe be a couple of videos long, on how to do hair and shade and paint it all together. So then I'll come back through here, and then I will Gaussian blur it until it's nice and soft where I want it to be, but you know, still have the detail. You can always play around with this. And later we're going to talk about smart objects and the power of smart objects, and how you can actually redo the blur without having to back up. This looks good, but it is way too strong, so I'm going to just back that off. And that's not looking too bad. So this is where we started. This is where we're at. And as you can see, this really didn't take that much time or a lot of work. And obviously we would do a lot more here for a real high-end retouch. Anyway, that's going to be it for this video. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of other stuff. You can mask with vectors and the pen tool and stuff, but I need to cover the pen tool first before we get into that. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed this. Subscribe, like, leave a comment, and catch you next time.